A steel frame from the 1980s weighs about 2.5 kilograms. A modern carbon frame weighs under 800 grams, a third of that. What breaks first when both frames crash is not what the spec sheet suggests. The weight myth. A 1984 Colnago Master, built from Columbus SL tubing, was one of the benchmark race frames of its era, and it's the frame most people picture when they hear, "Steel is slow." The problem is a number, not an opinion. A well-preserved 1980s steel road frame weighs somewhere between 2.5 and 2.9 kilograms, and writers assumed that gap could never close against a material built specifically to be light. Carbon's answer is a layup, not a substitution. Sheets of carbon fiber laid in specific directions, cured under heat and pressure into a shape that puts material only where load actually travels. A top-tier carbon frame today lands under 800 grams, some flagship models closer to 690. That's a genuine 2 kilogram swing on the frame alone. But here's the part the spec sheet buries. Professional racing has a mandated minimum bike weight of 6.8 kilograms, set by cycling's governing body over 2 decades ago, specifically because frames were getting so light that engineers worried about structural safety margins. Pro teams building carbon bikes under that limit now add ballast just to legally race them. The weight war carbon supposedly won produced bikes so light the sport had to put a floor under them. That's not a footnote. It's the whole argument for lighter is better running into its own ceiling. There's a second wrinkle most spec sheets never mention. The number on a carbon frame's box is usually the bare frame, unpainted, without the fork, seat post, or hardware, while a steel frame's quoted weight almost always includes the fork. Once both bikes are built up as complete, ready-to-ride machines, the real-world gap between a good steel racer and an entry to mid-range carbon bike shrinks to somewhere closer to 1 kilogram, not 2. Weight sells frames in a bike shop window, printed in bold on a spec sheet next to a price. What decides whether a rider actually wants to be on that bike for 4 hours is a completely different question. How the frame behaves underneath them once the road gets rough. The ride-feel equation. Bianchi and DeRosa built their reputations in the 1970s and 80s on a phrase frame builders still use unironically: steel is real. The problem those brands were solving wasn't speed, it was fatigue. A rider's body absorbing 5, 6, 7 hours of road vibration on unforgiving Italian or Belgian pavement. Steel's answer is a material property, not a marketing line. Its elastic modulus lets the tubes flex slightly under load and spring back, smoothing out small road imperfections before they reach the rider's hands and seat. Carbon's answer is more deliberate and, on paper, more sophisticated. Engineers tune the layup zone by zone, stacking stiffer fiber orientations at the bottom bracket for power transfer and softer, more compliant layups at the seat stays for comfort. The real-world proof shows up in a niche that never fully switched over. Long-distance randonneuring and audax riders, the ones doing 300 and 600 kilometer rides in a single push, still overwhelmingly favor steel or steel-adjacent builds because a frame that's marginally heavier but noticeably kinder to a rider's spine wins over 12 hours on the road. Carbon can be tuned to feel almost as forgiving, but tuning costs money. The compliant, expensive carbon layup and the harsh, cheap carbon layup weigh exactly the same on paper and ride completely differently in practice. Steel's forgiveness is a property of the material itself. Carbon's forgiveness is a property of the price tag. There's a reason the "steel is real" phrase stuck around for 50 years. Instead of fading with the bikes it described, riders kept quietly rebuying it, generation after generation, even after carbon had already won on paper everywhere else. Both frames can absorb a bad road surface. Neither one, it turns out, absorbs a bad crash the same way. None of what's coming next shows up in a marketing brochure. What happens to these frames after a crash, what a cracked frame actually costs to fix, and which material has quietly become the smart smarter financial bet for anyone buying today. If frame material debates like this are useful, subscribing keeps them coming. And there's a comment section below worth dropping an opinion into. Two very different failure stories are next. The crash test. Early carbon race bikes from the 1980s, models built by makers like Kestrel and TVT, weren't monocoque carbon the way frames are built now. They were carbon tubes bonded into aluminum lugs, essentially glued together at the joints. The problem that surfaced within a few seasons was bond failure. Those glued joints could separate under repeated stress or after an impact, sometimes with little external warning. The engineering solution the industry landed on was monocoque construction, molding the whole front triangle as one continuous piece, so there's no bonded joint to fail. A real advance, and one that makes modern carbon dramatically more reliable than its 1980s ancestor. But the underlying material behavior hasn't changed. Steel is ductile, meaning it bends, dents, and visibly deforms before it breaks, which gives a rider a warning sign long before catastrophic failure. Carbon is a composite, and composites tend to fail differently. A hard impact can crack resin internally without leaving a visible mark on the surface, which is exactly why nearly every bike mechanic's standard advice is to retire or professionally inspect a carbon frame after any serious crash, visible damage or not. Race teams now use tap tests and, at the top level, ultrasonic scanning to check for hidden internal damage that a visual check would miss entirely. Steel tells you when it's hurt. Carbon can be hurt and tell you nothing until the moment it isn't. It's worth being precise about what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean carbon frames are fragile or unsafe in normal use. Modern monocoque construction is tested to standards that make catastrophic failure from ordinary riding extremely rare. What it means is that the two materials fail on different timelines with different warnings, which changes how a rider should treat each one after something goes wrong. That difference in how damage announces itself is the whole story behind how long each material actually lasts on the road. The fatigue life problem. Steel has a metallurgical property most riders have never heard named but have absolutely experienced: a fatigue limit, a stress threshold below which the metal can be cycled essentially indefinitely without accumulating fatigue damage. That's the engineering reason a well-built steel frame from the 1960s, 70s, or 80s can still be ridden hard today, decades after it left the factory, provided it was never bent or corroded. The problem for the newer materials is that neither one shares that same behavior in the same way. Aluminum frames are the clearest counterexample. They're famous in the industry for effectively wearing out, developing fatigue cracks after enough stress cycles even under normal use, which is why aluminum race frames from the 1990s rarely get raced today. Carbon doesn't fatigue in that classical metallurgical sense at all when undamaged, but it degrades through different channels. Resin breaks down slowly under UV exposure, and any unnoticed impact damage compounds over time. The real-world proof is sitting in garages and vintage cycling events right now. Steel bikes built for riders who are themselves retired are still being raced at events like Leroyka, still structurally sound, decades past what anyone expected of them. The cultural nostalgia around old steel bikes isn't just sentiment. It's riders trusting a material that has quite literally already proven it lasts, decade after decade, in conditions modern lab testing can only approximate. Carbon frames haven't existed long enough at scale to run the same 40-year experiment, which means every claim about how a Tooth I-26 carbon frame will look in 2066 is still, honestly, a projection rather than a proven fact. What breaks that trust isn't the frame surviving on the road. It's what happens the day something finally does need fixing. That covers what happens to these frames on the road, what happens after, in a repair stand, and and on a price tag is where steel and carbon really split apart. The repair shop reckoning a cracked steel frame is, for a competent frame builder, a Tuesday afternoon problem. Heat, braze, or weld the affected tube, realign, repaint, done, often for a few $100s. A cracked carbon frame is a completely different kind of problem because that repair requires a specialized composite shop capable of cutting out damaged fiber, rebuilding the layup, and curing it under controlled heat and pressure, a process few general bike shops can do in-house at all. The real-world proof is in the warranty language every carbon manufacturer publishes. Crash damage is almost universally excluded from warranty coverage, which only protects against manufacturing defects, not impacts. So a rider who crashes a carbon frame is typically choosing between an expensive specialist repair that may not fully restore the frame's original strength or simply replacing it outright. And replacement is very often the cheaper, faster option. Steel forgives a crash financially. Carbon, once it's broken, usually just wants to be replaced. That asymmetry becomes even more interesting once you put both materials next to each other on a price tag today. The price that inflation forgot. A new race-ready carbon road bike with a modern electronic group set routinely runs anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 before a rider has even adjusted the saddle height. The assumption most people carry into a bike shop is that a 40-year-old steel frame is worthless by comparison, obsolete technology nobody serious would pay for. The market says otherwise. A fully restored, correctly spec'd vintage Colnago Master or De Rosa, built with period-correct Campagnolo components, regularly sells for figures well into 4 figures. Complete bikes have changed hands for close to $4,000, squarely inside the price range of a new carbon race bike. The real-world proof is the entire cottage industry now built around this exact fact. Specialist restoration shops in Europe and North America making a living exclusively off sourcing, rebuilding, and reselling vintage steel racers to collectors who could easily afford new carbon and are choosing not to. That's not nostalgia pricing propped up by sentiment. It's scarcity economics. Colnago isn't building more 1984 Masters. Every year, the supply of genuinely original, correctly dated frames only shrinks, while demand from riders who've discovered what steel feels like keeps climbing. Carbon depreciates like a car driven off the lot. A 3-year-old carbon race bike, however well cared for, typically sells for a fraction of its original price, because the next model year always claims to be lighter, stiffer, or more aerodynamic. Well-chosen vintage steel, it turns out, appreciates like the collector's item it's quietly become, moving in the opposite direction entirely. None of that market value exists without the races that built these frames' reputations in the first place. The race that changed everything steel dominated professional road racing for the entire golden era of the sport. Through the 1970s and into the late 1980s, on frames from Colnago, De Rosa, Pinarello, and Sinelli that carried multiple generations of champions across cobblestones, mountain passes, and Grand Tour finishes. The problem steel eventually ran into wasn't durability or ride quality. It was that carbon fiber, once the aerospace industry had matured the manufacturing process enough to make it viable for bikes, offered stiffness to weight numbers steel simply couldn't reach at any tube thickness. Through the 1990s, carbon crept into the professional peloton first as forks, then seat posts, then full frames, as teams chased every marginal gain the new material could offer. By the early 2000s, the transition was essentially complete. Steel had been raced out of the top level of the sport almost entirely, not because it failed, but because carbon offered a measurable edge in a discipline where fractions of a percent decide races. The cultural layer is what makes this more than an equipment footnote. An entire generation of riders came up watching legends win on steel, and that image never fully let go of the sport's identity, which is exactly why steel bikes now carry a weight of authenticity that no carbon frame, however advanced, has managed to inherit. There's an irony in how completely the transition happened. The same engineers chasing marginal gains in the 1990s were, without meaning to, manufacturing the scarcity that makes those old steel frames valuable today, since nobody was building more of them once the peloton moved on. Carbon won the race. Steel won the memory. And that split is exactly what's created a genuine collector's market for the bikes that got left behind. The collector's premium original, unrestored steel racing frames from recognizable makers and eras are now actively sought by a collector base that has grown well beyond nostalgic ex-racers. The problem for that market is scarcity. These frames aren't being remade, and every crashed, rusted, or repainted beyond recognition example permanently shrinks the pool of frames collectors consider genuinely correct. The response has been a professionalized restoration economy. Specialists who source period-correct components, verify frame serial numbers against manufacturer records, and rebuild bikes to exact original specification, commanding real premiums for doing it properly. The proof is straightforward and already covered. Restored examples changing hands for thousands of dollars, on par with or exceeding new carbon bikes. The culture around this goes deeper than resale value, though. Vintage cycling events built entirely around period-correct equipment, wool jerseys and all, have grown from a niche curiosity into a genuine international circuit. A bike that was simply what a rider used to race in 1985 has become, 4 decades later, both a functional road bike and a certified collector's object. A combination modern carbon, still depreciating on showroom floors, hasn't figured out how to match. Carbon wins on raw weight, and it's not close. Roughly a third the mass of a comparable steel frame. But weight is the only category where the win is that clean. Steel forgives crashes with a dent and a bend, where carbon can hide internal damage entirely. Steel fatigues almost never when built and maintained correctly. Carbon degrades through different, quieter channels. Steel is cheap and fast to repair almost anywhere. Carbon repair is specialized, expensive, and often skipped in favor of outright replacement. And in the one place nobody expected the comparison to reverse, well-chosen vintage steel now holds or gains value, while new carbon depreciates the moment it leaves the shop. None of this makes carbon the wrong choice. For racing, for pure performance, for shaving seconds off a climb, it remains the better tool. And that's not really in dispute. What the comparison actually reveals is that better was never a single-axis question to begin with. Carbon optimized for speed. Steel, almost by accident, optimized for longevity, repairability, and the kind of ride feel that only shows up after hours in the saddle rather than seconds on a stopwatch. The bikes that were supposedly replaced never really left. They just stopped being the fastest option and quietly became the most durable one instead. That's the real divide between these two materials. Not old versus new, but fast versus lasting. Subscribing means the next comparison like this one lands automatically, and dropping a preference for steel or carbon in the comments genuinely shapes which bikes get covered next.